All right. What are we experiencing in the African American community today regarding the family, marriages, and couples? The same compared to when the people you're in. God, I hate the way this is set up. Hold on. All right. What are we experiencing in the African American community today regarding family, marriages, and couples compared to how how it was when you were young adults growing up?
I'll say that, well, to me, it's still rather broad, and this is a gross generalization as a way of preface my statement. But in general, the we have fewer good, we have fewer, I guess, cross-generational examples of what constitutes a good relationship and what are the what are the characteristics of a good relationship. So what I mean by that is that uh, there aren't, uh, each successive generation doesn't have the opportunity to see good relationships modeled before them, and the the the, the reasons for that are myriad and complex. It's everything from uh, the breakup of centralized family groups. It's due to economics. It's not that people wanted to do that. It's institutional racism. It's just, it's a very complex situation. But by and large, from my viewpoint, what's happening is that people, the generation coming forward has fewer good examples of what constitutes good relationships. I mean, that's in a nutshell.
I think for some of the things, there are there are a lot of things that we assumed when we were younger, that most folks would have mom and dads in the home, and that um, oh, hold on, oh, and that certain values would be standard. We all kind of thought Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best and all that kind of stuff was the typical American household. What we've come to find out, however, is a lot of what we thought was typical was not. Um, I was amazed when I got to college because I did come from the Cosby household kind of thing. Um, when I got to college and discovered how many of my peers did not come from households like that, how many of my friends that I even learned um, when I was growing up that I thought were in households like that weren't. Um, I think a lot of what's happened in society is that we've given permission to discuss a lot of things that have been hidden. Um, and in discussing them, they become more acceptable, and more people have decided that they can use that as their role model, and it really has become more prevalent. But like I was saying, things like homosexuality have been were around in Caesar's time, but folks didn't really talk about it and weren't open about it, and so as people began to discuss it more, people began to feel a lot more comfortable in coming out of the closet, as they would say, or deciding to experiment with homosexuality, or looking at that as a lifestyle. I think the same thing has happened with a lot of things that have gone on in America. A lot of things that we used to think um, were unusual really weren't that unusual, but hadn't been discussed. And now that they're coming out, more people are looking at that as a lifestyle choice, whether it's single parenthood, whether it's and addicts, abusive relationships, a lot of things that have been hidden are now accepted. So,
but not necessarily for the better.
not necessarily for the better. I think, you just see a lot more of it. And so much of it is coming out with media and social media. And I think every generation tries something a little bit more outrageous than the generation before. Um, every generation has to have a point of rebellion. So, our generation, they did hippie stuff, and we went all out with, um, a whole Black Power movement, and um, your generation comes out with something to shock us, just like we did things to shock our parents. And so every generation has to come up with a new shock value. And I think some of that is part of what's happening in our society.
Adding to that, there was a certain level of rigidity and stratification with respect to value sets. Some of it was good, some of it wasn't so good. But everyone, because of that rigidity and stratification of behavioral norms, there was a great deal more compliance and conformity in behaviors. Now, all sorts of things may have been going on behind closed doors, but the outward appearances, everyone conformed to a certain agreed upon set of norms. And again, it's not making the time that we grew up so much better, but when we start looking at the characteristics of good, healthy relationships, and we start looking at what good self-image is, that values each individual and elevates. I'm seeing conversations, not just in media, but conversations and behaviors that don't elevate and celebrate. So, and I'll just leave it at that. And I think all of those things have had an impact.
All right, the next question is, what are the causes or origins of these social problems? Are they largely moral problems, as claimed by some critics, or are they because religious meaning no longer permeates the everyday life of the individual?
That's asking the same question in two different ways, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, well, basically, again, as I started off the other question, there's just simply a myriad of economic, social, psychological, environmental forces, as we move into the 21st century, that's having an impact on family constructs, what's agreed upon social norms and behaviors and social parameters. And so it's a little simplistic, to just simply talk about religious norms and so forth, because as we're seeing in, let's say in places like Great Britain and Europe in general, we have an increasing, decreasing numbers of people who subscribe to formalized religious practices that universally, and this also applies to the United States, where people will say, oh yeah, I believe in God, but when we start talking in terms of formalized religious practices and so forth, we have a decreasing numbers of participants. And so I just simply think that a lot of factors from new technologies and integrating those technologies in society, new overall behavioral norms, boundaries being changed, that we're seeing at play. and that we're constantly moving into new norms, and some of it is scary to people, and it's creating it's creating conflicts at all levels of society.
I think the question has an underlying assumption of Christianity. And when you start talking about deterioration of faith and morals, it sounds as though there's an underlying assumption that this is happening in the Christian church.
Or it could be ecumenical. I mean,
Yeah.
you could be
Yeah,
a member of Baha'i or
exactly.
Muslim,
And that's what I'm saying.
So
You know,
it doesn't have to be Christianity.
but for some faiths, some of these things are becoming more rigid. Other faiths is becoming more lax. So I think a lot of it has to do with your faith and what you have faith in. And I know that we've gotten to the point now where the religious norms, let's say of the Muslim community, are frowned upon because we say, you know, you shouldn't be stoning this couple because they had sex out of wedlock, or you know, they shouldn't be punished this way. Or
some norms.
Yeah, some of the norms. Yeah, not all of them.
Right.
But you know, some of them are frowned upon in an American society because it doesn't fit our current values. At the same time, you know, depending on which branch of Christianity you are in, it's either very accepting or very rigid. I mean, so when we start talking about norms and values and faith and religion, that's way too broad a topic to sum up in any kind of general term. We all have faith. Everybody has faith in something. We have faith in buildings that we walk into, or else we wouldn't go in them. We have faith in chairs that we sit in, or we wouldn't sit on them. And part of what's happening is we haven't taught and passed on our faith to our children in the same ways that we've received it.
Well, some people would disagree with that.
Yes.
Maybe I have passed on faith in materialistic, you know, approaches to life.
Well,
Okay,
yeah,
so it's
depends.
just.
But I'm saying I think that for some things, I remember when I was growing up, it was unusual. You know, it really wasn't accepted for a woman to be a single parent. That was frowned upon by the church. The woman was ostracized by the church. When we got liberal, it was when the child could be blessed in the church, but it was not during church service. It had to be after church. Now that's no longer an issue at all. There's certain things that have been modified and have become more accepted over the years. But that's not true of every faith and every religion. So I don't know how you give a general answer to that question other than, you know, from the standpoint of the religious beliefs that I've grown up with. It's probably much more liberal than it was when I was a child. And on some things less liberal than it was when I was a child. I think there's some things that got passed on, some things that didn't. I think there's some things that probably shouldn't have been passed on. You know, you think about Moses in the wilderness and how an entire generation had to be wiped out before they could receive God's blessing. And I think in some ways that's probably going to have to happen with some of our generation and the generation before us. There's some beliefs that we have that we've held on to, some things that we've had so ingrained in us in terms of how systemic racism has affected us, that I don't know that there's some issues that we'll get over in our lifetime. the fact that I saw a black president inaugurated is something I never expected to see in my lifetime. That's changed a lot of my viewpoints. But then it also has become very apparent in the last year or two that it doesn't matter what you do or how good you are, how smart you are, or how brave you are, or how bold you are, or how high you have risen in elevation in political life. If you are a certain hue and you fall into certain categories, you still are addressed the same way. And so, that has been a disturbing reality for me as well. But I keep having hope that, with another generation or two, things will change. Does that answer enough? Is there other parts of that you needed?
There's no other parts. I was waiting to see if you guys had something else to say. But, the next question. Though there are nevertheless obstacles that we face in America because of race, what can and should be done by us to solve some of the problems facing the nuclear family and marriage in our communities?
Wow. I think part of it is deciding to be committed to our families, um, to love unconditionally, and to pass on values to each other. Um, to for our younger generation to be willing to ask the questions and listen and learn, and for the older generation to understand the very different world that you live in. As Kahil Gibran would say, yours is a world we cannot visit, not even in our dreams. So the best we can do is to provide you with the best foundations we can, the best advice we can, the best support we can, and hope that you will grow to be the kind of young man or young woman that is required to make it in this society. So, there is a lot of systemic racism, and we need to make sure that you understand what that is, so you recognize it when you see it. But by the same token, my father, who grew up on a farm in Arkansas, one of 9 children in a little 3-room house, who went to school in a 1-room schoolhouse and rose through the ranks to learn to speak 6 or 7 languages and become a major national leader and all kinds of things of that sort, proves that it's not necessarily overwhelming when we run into obstacles. In some ways, not having the obstacles, I think, has weakened us as a people. It used to be that we rose to the occasion because of the opposition. Of course, we all hope and pray that we'll get to a point where that won't be necessary anymore. But I think we also need to be realistic in understanding that we have a responsibility, regardless of the obstacles that are placed in front of us. And then still be realistic about knowing that those obstacles will be placed there.
And keeping this really short, what would it look like? And the only thing I have to say is that each generation has its opportunities with respect to teachable moments. And each successive generation ends up having to relearn the struggles and the histories and the meaningfulness of the previous generation. And so it's a continuous dialogue. It's a continuous cross dialogue about whose we are, where we came from. It's a continuous dialogue or conversation that we've got to get to, okay, that talks to um, freedom ain't free, that in order to get to the promised land, you've got to go through the desert. There's opposition. Evil never rests. And so it's about not being it's not being placated by materialism. That's really short-lived. It's about a willingness, to face the evil, that's in front of you, and dealing with the oppression that's placed upon you, with an understanding that everyone doesn't make it to the promised land. So that's what I have to say about that.
All right. And the final question. According to Newsweek of March 3rd, 2003, from schools to jobs, black women are rising much faster than black men. What are the consequences of this development for the marriage market, relationships, and family in the African American communities?
Makes you a hot item.
Well, that's another complex one. And we've seen that it's not a new phenomena, okay? It really isn't. And we've had multiple generations where it was more acceptable for the black female to be in the marketplace as opposed to the black male. And that's also another gross generalization. And so it's not that the black female needed to be in the household, but in general, I think it without the black female ends up having to carry too much of the load. There's an imbalance. There's an unfairness. It erodes the foundation at some levels of the family unit. The family unit isn't nearly as cohesive. It's not nearly as strong. And so, but all of this has evolved primarily because of how work is structured in this country in connection with race. And so, in many instances, and this is also another really gross generalization, that the black male was subjugated in ways that precluded him from necessarily having the earning power that he should have, could have, eroded his upward mobility. But since the advent of the civil rights era, also anecdotally, so many black males, certainly in my generation, when jobs began to open, tended not to go to school. They tended to go to work because that was the ethos. Certainly within my family, go get that job. You can go to school later. And so when it was permissible, in so many circumstances, the black female went to school. Then she joined into the workforce. That's another one of those very complex anthropological, sociological questions, and it's just no simple answer other than the fact that we've had the same institutional racism, we've had the same skewed job markets, that's impacted the African American community and really people of color in general, and it skews family norms, whatever that is. It skews the whole fabric of family. So, but anyway, so.
I think one of the things you'll see a lot more is you'll see a lot more interracial marriages. As you have a shortage of black men,
viable
black men, who are out there in the dating market, so to speak. You'll start seeing, I think, a lot more. In all honesty, a lot more homosexuality, a lot more women who are turning to other women.
Vast numbers of black males incarcerated.
Yes. When you start, even in my generation, we used to sit up and start doing the numbers when you figure how many men have gone to war, how many men have been um, and homicide victims, how many men were incarcerated, how many men were drug addicts, how many men were already married, how many men were homosexual. It made a very small um, arena for dating for black women, especially black women who were educated and looking for partners with whom they would be somewhat equally yoked. Um, I got lucky. um, but it's tough. I know so many well-educated, beautiful, wonderful, skilled, creative, witty black women who are alone because there's just no one out there that that's available to them unless they want to find someone who is way outside of their social economic norms. And so you'll find a lot more women who are either on their own or with folks from other groups. And I think that's going to happen more often. And in some ways, that may not be the worst thing in the world because that does a whole lot to uh, stem racism as well. But there are more people of color throughout the world than there are, folks who are not of color throughout the world. And I think folks are going to just start spreading their nets a little bit more. The world has become much smaller. You can date over the internet with someone who's halfway around the world. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that I think people will connect and start new ways of having family that we probably had never thought about.
And the operative word is viable mates. And it's just simply, again, just in general, uh, the African American male increasingly becomes, in general, this is a gross generalization, becomes less viable for the upwardly mobile black female or the African American female. And she does indeed have options and choices. So that's yeah, it's a sad thought, but we may have left a generation or several generations in the wilderness.
And you're also running into a lot more um, women of color who are reaching that biological clock age and deciding that they want to be a mother, that they want to have children. And that's another reason for people to start thinking about single parenthood. They make good money, they're out there,
Don't need you.
well, at least you start off thinking that, but trust me, you know, single parenthood is a tough thing to do. So that's my thoughts on that.
All right, thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson.
You're welcome, Mr. Johnson.
And that concludes this interview. Thank you.